Presuppositionalists claim that inductive reasoning can only be justified by reference to Christian presuppositions. Bahnsen asks, what right have we to read the future into the past? The universal uniformity of nature cannot be verified from the experience of the independent thinker in any final sense, since that principle exceeds the bounds of his experience. So the most fundamental premise of all autonomous science, the uniformity of nature, is neither empirically nor rationally justifiable. Bahnsen contends that David Hume demonstrated that there is no justification for believing that the future will be like the past. To argue that the sun will rise tomorrow because it has risen every other day assumes that there is regularity in nature. But why should this be assumed? One cannot justify this belief by appealing to the past, for that assumes the very thing one is attempting to prove. We could only know that the future will be like the past if we already knew that regularity exists in nature. Thus, to appeal to the past is circular reasoning. As Colin Howson puts it, that inferences of the same type have been successful in the past will not work without circularity, for that evidence is itself merely a record of what has happened in the past, and any conclusion based on it would therefore presuppose the validity of inferences from past to future, the question at issue. The presuppositionalist solution to Hume's problem is to presuppose the reality of the Christian God, who reveals that nature exhibits regularity because he upholds it and ensures that it functions in accordance with the laws which he has created. But does Hume's argument really demonstrate what the presuppositionalist claims? Is there no justification for induction apart from presupposing the existence of the Christian God?
Right away, I want to point out that it's possible to interpret presupposition many different ways, and so it's unclear which concept of presupposition Pallmann is using. It's not inaccurate to say that people in the Van Tillian tradition, people who hold to a revelational epistemology, believe that one must presuppose Christianity, and so the Christian God, in order to um, practice induction, that the performance of making inductive surveys and things of that nature involves a belief on the part of the thinker in the Christian God. That's not inaccurate. But nevertheless, the claim is much stronger from Bahnsen, Frame, and other Van Tillians. The claim is that one needs to know that Christianity is true. Specifically, that one needs to be the recipient of revelation from God. So I just wanted to be clear. It's not that Pallmann is necessarily constructing a straw man, but it should be clear that the presuppositionalist, so-called, is not merely supposing that one must assume something with no justification, that one must assume God in order to make inductive inferences. For that would be to fall victim to the very same objection that Bahnsen and others are making against the kind of justifications people propose for induction, namely making assumptions. The justification that the so-called presuppositionalists, that is the justification that is offered by revelational epistemology, is God's revelation, wherein he makes people acquainted with himself, familiar with his laws, familiar with his wise way of sustaining and ruling the universe, innately because they're imago Dei, and through their experience, because their experiences of a revelatory creation. So that's, let's just be clear, that's the cashing out of presupposing God.
I am convinced that there is a way to justify induction in a non-circular way and apart from presupposing God. Now we need to be clear from the start that it is somewhat misleading to speak of the problem of induction as if there was only one. There are in fact two distinct problems which we will need to solve in order to justify inductive inferences. First, we need to explain how a method of inference which does not logically entail the truth of the conclusion still renders it genuinely probable and thus justificatory. Second, we need to explain how one can be justified in inferring something about an entire population from a sample. Let's turn to the first problem. When making a deductive argument, it is easy to explain why we should believe the conclusion. Its truth is guaranteed if the premises are true. The situation for inductive arguments
I just want to point out that there is actually an analogous problem of deduction in which one can ask how it is the case that an individual, limited as he is in his knowledge, limited as he is in his faculties, limited as he is in his experiential horizon, can make the kind of judgments universal that are needed for deductive arguments to guarantee the truth of their conclusion should the premises be true. For example, if I say all men are mortal, how is it possible that me, a mere mortal man, can know something like the universal that all men are mortal? And how do I judge that something universally follows from that universal? So, for example, because all men are mortal, it's supposed that because Socrates is a man, therefore he's mortal. But how do I know, as a mere mortal man, there is no possible world, so to speak, in which Socrates isn't mortal and yet is a man? Or, if we don't like possible world semantics, how do I rule out what is compossible with the premise that all men are mortal, or that Socrates is a man? How am I in a position epistemically to judge what follows from what? That's not to say that this is an objection to anything Nimesh is saying. I'm just pointing out that there, in fact, is a cousin problem for deduction, very much like the problem of induction. I should also point out that it's not necessarily the case that Pallmann and Bonson, or Hume for that matter, are in agreement on what the problem of induction is. There are various issues that can be raised with induction, and Nimesh certainly brings up valid issues to consider that need to be resolved. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that Nimesh is covering what Bonson is bringing up, the problem that Bonson pursues. And I'll comment on that in a bit.
Seems quite different, since induction only renders its conclusions probable. Just how is it that we can be rational in believing an inductive argument's conclusion if that conclusion could turn out to be false? The solution to the problem of induction is found in direct inference or the proportional syllogism, a non-deductive inference form. Direct inferences follow the same structure as traditional deductive syllogisms, however they differ in that the crucial premise is proportionate to the given frequency of some property within a reasonably large sample of a population. Timothy and Lydia McGrew explain, direct inference is perhaps the simplest and most natural expression of a degree of entailment interpretation of probability. Given that the frequency of some property X in a population G is P, and given that A is a random member of G with respect to possession of X, the probability that A is an X is P. In a traditional deductive syllogism, we reason that all G are X, A is a G, with full assurance that A is an X. In a similar way, the proportional syllogism would reason that M of n G are X, A is a G, with assurance M of n that A is an X.
Okay, imagine that there are a set of ducks right now, and we somehow come to collect all of the ducks. And all of the ducks we see at the time we're collecting them are black. And so we reason as follows. You know, 7 out of 7, let's just say there were 7 ducks, right? 7 out of 7 of the ducks are black. Billy Bob is a duck, and so Billy Bob is black. In a world in which there is no regularity, perhaps Billy Bob will be white by the time I've said the first premise. Yeah, so you can clearly see that direct inference has really done no work whatsoever to get around regularity. It is just as dependent on what Bonson calls a uniformity premise, any other kind of inference. By the way, as Bonson would say, deduction is just as dependent on this kind of regularity. I mean, you can hardly reason about the properties that make up a square, or that 2 plus 2 equals 4 in any deductive fashion, if the very reality we live in is such that concepts like 4 don't find purchase, or that numbers can have different properties at any given moment. regularity underlies any kind of inference whatsoever. It's the stakes are much stronger than Pallmann is taking into account. So via the situation that I just gave with the ducks, you can see you can only assess M of n in a world in which there's a proprietarian law uh, divinely set by God, by which ducks can be individuated and classified in virtue of their properties because those properties follow patterns. For example, genetic patterns. There are certain ways that ducks inherit um, the color of their feathers in virtue of their genetic inheritance, right? So that would be an example of some kind of principle, pattern, causal chain, law, whatever you wish to call it, that God has set in order that would explain why you might have access to M and N, of N. But you have no access to M of N if you have no access to the regularity of the world. Perhaps Pallmann wants to say, in response to the imaginary scenario I proposed, well, at the time we collected the ducks, we could conclude that they were black. So even though they turned white in an instant before we could even make arguments, it was the case that our inference was justified at the time when they were all black. Okay, well, there's two problems with that. First of all, there's no meaningful sense in which we can make inferences at all, given that our conclusions can be undermined by the time we make the first premise, or before then. If things can be so chaotic that we can't find any hold on the nature of things, then we can't even formulate the premises of the argument. Remember, we can't get access to M of N, which is only part of his putative inference that solves the problem of induction. The other issue is just that Pallmann there would be assuming in that counter that time follows a certain pattern, that there's a regularity of temporal nature. Well, why suppose that the past can't change? I mean, suppose we're the audience of a chaotic God who changes the past facts all the time. So the ducks were at one point black, and now the past is such that they were not black. I mean, Pallmann might make some kind of argument about time at that point, but then he's gone right into the metaphysical realm that Bahnsen has argued we need knowledge of in order to justify induction, and that's going to involve view of God. So, yeah, I do believe Pallmann has really underestimated the issue and is really not offering much in the way of an answer that Aristotle didn't already try.
Can be done through a combination of Bernoulli's theorem and a second direct inference. According to Bernoulli's theorem, most large samples differ only a little from the populations from which they are drawn. With this theorem and a second direct inference, we can construct an argument which will rationally extend our knowledge to the unsampled members of a population. Once again, such an inference is only probabilistic. However, since this method does not assume that the unsampled members of a population will be like the sampled members, it avoids circularity while giving us rational justification for extending our knowledge beyond our own experience. Hence, we have a cogent response to Hume's problem of induction. We do not have to presuppose the uniformity of nature. The McGrews conclude, this solution to the problem of induction is of more than academic interest. Prima facie,
There's not much to say in response to that, except that Pallmann is name dropping, but he doesn't seem to display any so-called Bernoulli's theorem plus a direct inference in any way that we can see what it's doing to get around Hume's problem of induction. Just how are we going to have inferences that X is like Y, that they can be species of a class, if we have no reason to suppose that Y is like X? I think contra the McGrews, prima facie, there just is no way to justify inferences to classifications of that nature without those justifications being or constituting reasons to think that the members of the class are like one another. To talk about a theorem that could supposedly get around that is a pipe dream.